I'll start right away with the current trend to screen all students in a school for mental health issues. So offering some kind of standardized screening where all the students in a class through, questions on a computer or whatever will be screened to see where they fall in terms of their depression, anxiety, and those sorts of things. What is your take on that?
Hmm. Where is this happening? Is this like a new universal, or have you heard about it in
It is part of the SEL social emotional learning program that is really it's been in place in schools for decades, but the screening is newer. I would say this has been going on depending on your location from 2017 forward, but it really intensified in the last 2 years post COVID because there was a huge infusion of cash from the federal government and some very big tech companies funded in part by things like the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation and Bill Gates and so forth, where the data is being fed not just to the government but to these companies as well.
Wow, do you know what, assessment tools they're using or what these questions are?
hmm Yeah, profiled them on the channel. It's a really long inventory of questions that are things up until 13 years of age. The teachers are doing it for the students. So the teachers, or if it's a daycare situation, they're actually going as young as 18 months. They're doing 18 months to 36. They have a different assessment. And the adults are checking boxes like it's a scale of, sometimes, never, often, those kinds of little boxes. And it'll say in the past 4 weeks or in the past week, how many times have you seen the student do X or be X? And the questions can be things like seem happy, make eye contact, or be helpful to other people, seem excited about something, demonstrate curiosity, um, you know, like all kinds of subjective questions. I could probably go find one of the questionnaires if you wanted to see one, but they are very long. There'll be dozens and dozens of questions, and I would say 90% of them are, if not 100%, subjective to the person answering the questions, and it doesn't become a self-reporting tool until usually after 13 years of age.
Okay. Yeah, so this is concerning on a number of levels, right? One is that this is school, not therapy, and not home. Two is that this is, like you said, very subjective, and it sounds like it lacks validity. I mean, my first thought when you said that this is happening is, I wonder if they're using like the GAD-7, the generalized anxiety disorder scale number 7, right? With, at least some uh, measures that have some validity to them. Not that it would be appropriate for those scales to be administered by people who aren't mental health professionals, right? Because as mental health professionals, we know how to interpret those things in light of other factors.
Right.
I also feel concerned about the time scale. I mean, in the last 1 week, in the last 4 weeks, that's such a short period of time. And if this data is then being used to identify, oh, maybe this kid needs counseling, we need to pull them from class and take them to the school counselor just because they had a bad week or something like that. Um, I mean, I think that schools have some responsibility. Anyone who's in contact with children has some responsibility to just kind of verify that things are okay at home, right? Teachers are mandated reporters, just like I am as a therapist, just like doctors are. And so we need to be able to recognize signs of abuse or neglect. And there might
Sure.
be, certain questions that themselves wouldn't be too upsetting to the kids, but that just might kind of be able to assess whether there's some kind of extra support needed. But those would be questions. I mean, maybe at the beginning of the year, making sure that the kid has a pediatrician, right? Because if they
Right.
have a pediatrician, that's a sign that the parents are, maintaining their wellness and that the doctor is then going to be responsible. And then the pediatrician should have a certain level of responsibility for making sure everything's okay at home. But those are professional roles, and assigning it to teachers and making it this subjective, perceptions of happiness, things like that, it just makes me wonder what's the point
Right.
and whether children feel like they're scrutinized or under a radar. I also think that kids look to adults for guidance as to whether something is a big deal or not. Like, is it a big deal that I am not happy today? It's like, no, it's not a big deal. You had a day, right? You know, the kids didn't want to play basketball with you today, but you haven't been excluded and bullied for years and years. It's going to be okay. And that's what fosters resilience, and that's such an important part of kids learning to manage normal anxiety, is just for them to be able to look to us and get the sense that nope, it's just a skinned knee, it's not the end of the world. I've been
Right.
thinking today in preparation for this episode about a couple of observations. Um, One I'll never forget from years ago was I want to make sure I don't share anybody's personal information, but just a situation where I observed a couple bringing their baby into a room. You know, the baby's maybe like 1 year old, that the baby had never been in before. And the baby was showing signs of fear, as you do when you're a baby in an unfamiliar environment. And the dad, probably thinking that he was being empathetic and emotionally intelligent as a parent, said, "Scary." You know, like he was mirroring the kid's feelings. And it's like, no, no, you're teaching the kid that this normal uncertainty that an infant or a baby experiences in a new environment is in fact an indicator that there's some kind of reason for concern there, when really your role as a parent is to give your child appropriate cues as to whether this environment is safe or not. And in this case, this is a perfectly safe environment.
Mhm.
Another story that's been coming to mind would be an example of a kid having intrusive thoughts of recognizing that they could be harmed, or that they could harm somebody. Uh, Recognizing that harm is possible and having scary thoughts about that isn't necessarily an indicator that harm is happening, or that the kid has anybody to be afraid of, or that they're actually wanting to harm themselves, right? There's a big difference between, oh my gosh, I could cut myself, and I really want to cut myself, right? Those are very different things. And some kids, let's say they're 8, 9, 10, they're having this thought for the first time in their life. It's never occurred to them before that they could be harmed or that they could do harm. And when we have a thought that's disturbing, um, there's a part of our mind, I like to call it playfully the disaster detector, that's like scanning your thoughts, that goes, ah, that's an alarming thought. And then it hones in on that thought and gives a lot of emphasis. And what a kid needs in a situation like that is just for the adults to say, oh, yeah, that's a scary thought. That is true. It's true. You have the potential that you could hurt someone if you got aggressive, but you wouldn't do that, would you? Right? Like they just need us to say, it's just a thought. You are not your thoughts. And, you know, I think there's so much emphasis on this like mental cleanliness and this obsession with fixating on our minds, that people are forgetting that you don't have to believe every thought you think. You can't always control what thoughts go in and out of your mind. I mean, we have thousands of them a day, but you can decide how you interpret them, how much energy and focus you give them, and which parts of yourself to feed.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. I did want to add that some of these screenings they'll say are to detect, early detection, what they call early warning signs of, pathology of some kind of mental health problem. But they also claim the companies selling these products, it's mostly companies that are selling them to the school districts, that they can also uh, prevent academic failure, and they can detect whether the child has enough what they call protective factors. And so what they do then with these surveys is they group the children. It's not just an individual report. They group the children by who has protective factors, who doesn't, who needs what they call more, it's a more intervention, and they mean it in a classroom sense. In other words, they don't mean it in, a clinical sense. And they're talking about things like they're using terms. These are the terms that they use that they're looking for: self-awareness, self-management, goal-directed behavior, social awareness, relationship skills, personal responsibility, decision making, and optimistic thinking. Now, all of those sound pretty good, right? As a parent, you're like, yeah, I want my kid to have all those things. The devil is in the details, because when you read their definitions of things like relationship skills, a child's consistent performance of socially acceptable actions that promote and maintain positive connections with others. Now, I can get with maybe half of that definition, okay? And there are others, like even social awareness. There's they mention impact on others, which to me a student could interpret that as, oh, now I have to anticipate what all my impacts are going to be, and you can't possibly do that. And personal responsibility is focused on group. So this is the last one I'll tell you. A child's tendency to be careful and reliable in his or her actions in contributing to group efforts. That's in personal responsibility, not social. And so you take terms that seem like we all understand what they mean, but when you add their definitions, it starts to paint a picture of, we consider the appropriate way to act or the appropriate way to feel and think and be is group directed, externally focused, and so on. Okay. There seems to be a, like an agenda, for lack of a better word. And when they then say we're going to group the children, it's hard for someone like me who analyzes this stuff not to wonder, are they going to project things into the children? Are they going to identify things as pathologies that are just a normal, different, introverted person, a person who's shy? Are we going to pathologize shyness because the person doesn't want to make those kinds of connections all the time? And so I would ask you, does this kind of a thing concern you when they say we can head off academic failure this way? We can head off mental health problems by grouping the kids and labeling the kids like this, that they'll say they're strong. They call it strong, typical, or like needs work.
It sounds really scrutinizing, and it makes me wonder, why is this necessary in comparison to what any decent adult, the kind of adult that goes into being a teacher, especially, right? Generally, teachers have big hearts for children. Um, why is that? Why is it not good enough that when an adult is properly resourced and not overwhelmed by, let's say, a large class size, that it's our natural tendency to observe kids and see who needs extra support in the social skills department, right? And that doesn't have to come in some structured form. It can just come through, you're seeing kids on the playground and you decide that now's a moment to say, hey, I think he'd really like the ball. Will you pass the ball to him? Right? Those little moments that just happen organically when we're actually focused and present with kids. And it just makes me wonder, who's making money off of selling this kind of curriculum or program? And wouldn't that money better be spent on reducing class sizes and paying teachers better and having the classrooms just be more resourced in general? Because I think that when we're well resourced, we do those things naturally. And it's about the relationship, right? So much of helping kids grow just comes organically through relationships. There's no substitute for quality time, role models, and, just people being attentive with one another. And when I hear about how rushed the school schedule is and how overwhelmed teachers are, I think they're barking up the wrong tree with the stuff. These kids don't need to be assessed in schools by people who aren't really qualified to conduct those assessments. They don't need these special programs. They just need attention.
Right. Yeah. I would agree with you. And I think when you talk about resourced, I think part of that would go into the training of the teachers, not so they can be clinicians, but so that they can be trained to be observers. And I do think that is something you can learn to be better at. I will give my graduate program credit for one thing. We were required for the entire year that we were student teaching, because we student taught for a year, to keep a detailed journal of our observations. And we had to have a detailed, sort of observation of every single one of our students, and we had to provide evidence. So in other words, you couldn't just watch a kid and say so and so did this. You had to put down what if you had a concern, why you had a concern, what they did, what you did about it, did it work, did it not work? So it was almost like you were conducting your own you weren't conducting research on them that was going to impact them negatively. That'd be unethical. It was more just observing them and then planning your teaching accordingly to try to, remediate where you thought they needed help. But the goal was to have that become more organic, more automatic, that this is not maybe something that we're all naturally good at. And especially those of us who don't have our own children, I think parents have, or people who spend a lot of time around children, have a tendency to have had some practice at this. But even as a parent, I don't observe other people's children nearly as well or as intuitively, using all of my faculties as well as I do my own. But this really did help. And so things like that can be a resource.
Mhm.
That kind of professional development, rather than we're going to teach you how to use this computerized system, which is
Mhm.
what they spend a lot of time doing.
Yeah, and you talk about learning on your channel, and I think the way we learn as adults too, um, comes through observation and speculation and testing out hypotheses, right? One of my best teachers in my grad program in counseling had this very Socratic method of teaching. It was I took family therapy and child therapy with him. And I remember in our family therapy class, it was a small, intimate group. We'd have hours together, and he would present a case. He would say, okay, parents bring in their kid, and this is the presenting problem. What do you think is going on here? And we would muse and speculate and hypothesize. And it was getting our own gears going that really taught us those skills. And what I'm
Mhm.
hearing instead is that these things are very prescribed, right? It's like measure this, measure that, measure that. And if the score is this, then it means that. And that's not the same as observation and thinking
Right.
yourself. Another thought that's popping into mind is that, if we have time to hypothesize, then and if we're open to all possibilities rather than looking for, oh, this kid needs counseling or they're autistic or whatever, then, the reason that a kid looks like they're in a bad mood could be because they have a stomach ache, right? Like there's so many reasons that a kid could be presenting with indicators that they're not emotionally their best. And we don't need to jump to conclusions about what that means or what the solution is or
Right.
whether a solution is needed.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Are we a solution in search of a problem to,
Mm.
fix so we can like justify something? Um, what about boundaries? As a parent, picturing my child in this situation, I just feel like it's so intrusive.
Yeah, I agree. And childhood is a time to learn what boundaries are appropriate, right? And if the adults around you are modeling something so invasive, then that is, some people would say that that's maybe a form of grooming. I think about my own work experiences as an adult, and I had a work environment once where the boundaries were very poor and the personal relationships and the feelings between people were a lot more front and center than I personally felt comfortable with. And I felt like it made us inefficient. It really distracted us from what we were there to do, which was ironically child and family therapy because there was so much
Mhm.
coworker drama. And it just felt like you couldn't just mind your own business and have a personal life that was separate. Instead, it was like all your stuff had to be out and everybody's business. And I think that the workplace and the school environment they're not mental health treatment centers. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be, understanding and accommodating to people under certain situations where they might need some time off or some accommodations. But I think we already have those structures in place. Like there are laws, for disability accommodations at work. There are laws like the Family Medical Leave Act, where, if you have, let's say, you're working at a job for a few years and then some acute trauma happens. Let's say you're in a shooting, right? And now you have acute stress disorder or PTSD, right? Your employer has to approve if you need to leave 2 hours early on Wednesday to see a therapist. Like that, those provisions are already in place. And I think most people would be happy having a relationship with their boss where they don't know everything about their personal life, but where they feel comfortable enough because those professional boundaries are in place, that they have a positive, neutral relationship, that they could come to their boss and say, my kid's sick today, or I'm sorry, I have a migraine. Do you mind if I like do a little extra work on Saturday? I think most people would be comfortable with that, right? But when there's a sense that everything about me is transparent to everyone and everyone's business, it's a recipe for disaster when it comes to mental health because we already have several cognitive biases that don't work in our favor. So one of them is the spotlight bias, right? The spotlight bias is the perception that everyone can see everything about you, that you're like in a spotlight or under a microscope. This is a really common error that we make because we're just self-focused and we're our own worst critics and we think everyone can see our flaws. Um, it's part of therapy sometimes to just teach people, everyone thinks that, right? Like nobody's scrutinizing that thing about you because they're too busy thinking that you're scrutinizing this thing about them that you didn't even notice, right? People with social anxiety, people with depression tend to have quite a spotlight bias sometimes, and it only makes them more insecure and neurotic and self-focused rather than curious about the world around them. Um, so I can imagine that going to school where you're there to learn, um, and then having your psychological insides examined, or just normalizing that it's other people's business to know like what you ate for lunch and all of that, like it just kind of confirms this suspicion that all eyes are on me, and then kids have fear of their own thoughts. I've seen this in anxiety in kids. It's like it comes with guilt and shame, like, oh my God, I thought a bad thought. Or, heaven forbid, kids who see something on the internet that they're not supposed to see, and then they feel guilty about it for a long time. And it's like, no, you can relax. Nobody can see what you're thinking. There are some things that generally come across like through facial expressions, and if you come to school looking unkempt, people might worry. But your thoughts are your own private business. You can learn to manage them. Not everything you think is a problem. And it's not necessarily a problem if you're not happy all the time because it's life.